Hey everybody, this is Dr. Oob. I'm actually going to be going back to some of the basics in my next few videos, and I want to talk about in this video, why do I have high blood pressure? As many of you know, most Americans suffer from the three main trilogies, the high blood pressure, the high cholesterol, and the diabetes. So I want to get back to the basics in functional medicine and talk to most Americans. And the first step in this is I want to talk about why do you even have high blood pressure? I find that if people can understand the cause to their illness or ailment or chronic disease, then a lot of times it makes them more motivated to try and figure out what might have caused that. High blood pressure is actually very complicated and difficult to ascertain what may be causing your symptoms or high blood pressure. So in this diagram, I'm going to try to go through try to simplify the blood pressure and how it's regulated by your body. And in that, we will come up with ways blood pressure medications work, ways you can naturally reduce your blood pressure, and understanding why. So this whole cycle is very complicated, and I'm not going to try to rewrite a medical textbook or anything. I'm going to try to simplify it for the layperson. For all you Google scholars out there, I apologize if I say something a little too simplified or slightly incorrect. So basically in this cycle, as you can see, we've drawn a heart, an artery, the kidneys, and the veins. And if you notice, these are constantly in circulation, responding to each other, talking to each other at all times. And in the middle is the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are responsible for controlling most of the hormones that go along with this cascade. But I want to talk about each component individually and how they relate to blood pressure. But the first thing to understand is, what is blood pressure? So the whole idea is when someone checks your blood pressure by putting the cuff on your arm and squeezing your arm, they're giving you a systolic and a diastolic measurement. So what does that mean? All that means is that is the amount of pressure of the blood rushing through your arteries that's giving you that pressure reading. So what most people don't know is that the majority of blood isn't actually pumped by the heart. The majority of your blood is actually pumped by each artery in your system. So yes, the heart is responsible for ejecting the blood, but what you don't know is that the artery is designed to expand and accept that blood that the heart has pushed out. Once it expands and accepts that blood, it actually squeezes down on it, pushing the blood down the stream. If we had to depend on our heart to pump the blood throughout our body, we would actually die. You don't have enough pressure from the heart to push blood all throughout that. So what happens is when this artery expands, receiving the blood at its maximum potential, as much pressure as it can take, that's your systolic pressure. Then what happens is the artery squeezes down on it, squeezing all the blood, as much of it as it can before the next heartbeat. That lowest pressure that you hit as the artery is squeezing down on it is your diastolic pressure. So mostly in medicine, we're really worried about the systolic version of the blood pressure. We used to look at a lot of diastolic, but over time it seems like most of the articles are referencing the systolic, because the systolic is the more important to treat and the more important goal. So in general, in conventional medicine, we want to aim for a systolic blood pressure of under 140. If you're over 140, you're considered as having stage 1 high blood pressure, hypertension. If you're over 160, you're considered as having stage 2 high blood pressure, in which you'd be put on medication for being over 140. What is the ideal blood pressure? I don't think anyone really knows that answer, but I've read a few athletic articles that suggest that the healthiest athletes are at 115 systolic. So that's generally what I tell all my patients they want to aim for. And of course, the smaller frame, shorter individuals can be closer to 100, some people down to 90. But if your blood pressure is too low, that can actually be a sign of adrenal dysfunction and adrenal problems. So now that we understand that the basics of blood pressure comes from the artery, we have to understand the whole cascade and all the process. So I'm going to start at the top of the diagram with the heart. As you probably know, the heart is not shaped like that, but it's definitely easier to recognize like that. So the heart is responsible for increasing the blood pressure through two main ways. Although technically the same, the body sees it as two different ways. So the heart increases its contractility, which means how hard it squeezes down on the blood. And by squeezing harder down on the blood, it can pump more out. If it pumps more out, obviously the systolic pressure goes up. The other thing it does is it increases its stroke volume. It receives more blood and pumps more blood out. And by doing so, it increases the systolic and diastolic pressures. After the blood has left the heart, then it goes to the artery. And the artery is responsible, as we already discussed, as far as squeezing down on it. We call this the arterial tone. So the more tone to the artery, the higher the tone, the more flexion of the artery, the higher the blood pressure. And this is regulated via hormones and the sympathetic nervous system, or the fight or flight system, or the panic system. We will be talking about that multiple times in these blood pressure videos. After the blood leaves the artery, then it goes to the various organs, all the organs. But in this diagram, we're mainly going to be talking about the kidneys because they play an important role in regulating the blood volume. So the arteries pump blood to the kidneys. If the blood pressure is too high, this may seem kind of counterintuitive, but as the blood pressure gets too high, you actually get less blood flow to certain parts of the body, and the kidneys can sense this. After the blood leaves the artery, it then goes to the kidneys, and the kidneys are mainly responsible for addressing the blood volume. How much blood do we have? So if the kidneys are sensing that there's not enough blood, it actually starts releasing hormones in order to indicate the body that we need to take in more blood or take in more salt, which increases our water volume, increases our blood volume, and that increase in blood volume goes to the veins. Although veins, you may not realize, in your body, they act as a tank, a reservoir for the excess blood. The majority of your blood that you carry in your body is actually just sitting in your veins, ready to be accessed at any moment. So God forbid a lion jump into this room and I need to take off running, what will happen is my veins will squeeze down in order to squeeze more blood to the heart, and the more blood that goes to the heart, the more blood that goes to the arteries, and then the more blood that goes to the organs like muscles in order to run from this lion. So mainly the veins act as a reservoir, although the arteries are the things responsible for the systolic and diastolic pressure. The veins are responsible for managing the blood volume or holding on to that blood volume, and by increasing its output, it increases the cardiac output of the heart, and thus increasing the blood pressure. So this is the cycle that goes on all day long. But this cycle is managed by multiple things inside of your body. Primarily, the adrenals are the ones that are responsible for carrying out the blood pressure. So we will be talking a lot about the adrenals, and if you know anything about the adrenals already, I've done other videos on adrenal dysfunction and adrenal fatigue, but in this case, we're going to be talking about the main activity of the adrenals to release cortisol, aldosterone, and the adrenaline molecules, epinephrine and norepinephrine. So all of these hormones, they actually stimulate various sections of this pathway in order to create higher and higher blood pressure. And you will see as we get into medications how the medications try to block some of these things from actually happening, and that's how they lower blood pressure. So if you notice, I drew adrenals in the middle of the diagram because they affect every part of this. So let's talk about it. The adrenals release cortisol, and cortisol goes all over the body and stimulates things. The other way to look at it is cortisol is kind of the whisperer around the system. It's the Paul Revere of America that's going around the system whispering, hey, adrenaline may come, get ready, prepare everything, adrenaline may come. So without cortisol, adrenaline can't actually work. You need both in order to work. So elevated levels of cortisol doesn't always immediately cause adrenaline or elevated blood pressure. What happens is too high of cortisol for too long oversensitizes the body to the natural amounts of adrenaline, and that's what can cause the elevated blood pressure. So if the adrenals are being stimulated, cortisol is being released, and it's stimulating every piece. So cortisol stimulates the heart to increase its contractility, increase its stroke volume, tells the arteries to increase its tone or squeeze down on blood more. It actually goes down to the kidneys and stimulates salt reabsorption. That's why people who take steroids or have too much cortisol actually have leg swelling and edema. Their weight goes up because they start retaining salt. Now, cortisol does cause salt retention, but I do want to point out the main hormone that the adrenals release to cause the kidneys to increase its salt consumption is actually aldosterone. They're both made in the adrenals, but aldosterone is a little more powerful at absorbing salt than the other. And so once the kidneys increase their salt, as the kidneys increase their salt production, it increases the blood volume, and thus the veins start filling up with fluid. So by increasing the blood volume, then that goes to the heart, increases the amount the heart can pump out, and of course increases the blood pressure. So primarily in this diagram, we're talking about the adrenals as regulating the blood pressure. So a big focus is going to be on the adrenals. But as you may or may not already know, what regulates the adrenals? That's where we're going to get into the sympathetic autonomic nervous system, or SANS. Okay? SANS is your sympathetic nervous system. It is your fight or flight, is your panic system. So the sympathetic nervous system actually stimulates almost every piece of this diagram. It does it directly, and it does it through the hormone cascade. Primarily, it does it by stimulating the adrenals, and then the adrenals carry out its workload with cortisol and aldosterone. Conversely, PANS, or parasympathetic autonomic nervous system, is designed to turn off the sympathetic nervous system. So the idea here is that the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, they are always in balance. Only one can be turned on at a time. They need to be in balance at all times. So in our typical American lifestyles of drinking too much coffee, smoking too many cigarettes, working too many hours, not sleeping enough, we're constantly activating our sympathetic nervous system, our fight or flight system, and really we're turning off our parasympathetic, our rest and digest system. And what you can see here, that's one of the main culprits in high blood pressure. Too much stimulation to the sympathetic nervous system, too much cortisol, too much aldosterone, too much artery tone, too much heart volume, too much salt intake by the kidneys, too much blood volume, and this cycle goes on. Now, one thing that's really common in conventional medicine is once you're diagnosed with high blood pressure, they heavily focus on reducing the salt intake in your body. And if you'll notice when I get into the treatment videos, I hardly talk about salt at all. Only a small percentage of the population, somewhere around 20 to 25% of the population, is actually sensitive to salt. The kidneys are responsible for managing the salt. So regardless if you cut the salt or eat a lot of salt, the kidneys are going to regulate how much salt you intake via the aldosterone. Now, you can reduce your salt intake so much that your kidneys can't keep up, so you can lower your blood pressure that way, but that's not really a healthy thing to do. Your body needs salt. It's one of your most common electrolytes, if not the most common electrolyte. So that is the basics behind the hormone cascade that causes the blood pressure. What I want to get into next is how do medications affect this diagram. Now that we have our diagram drawn and our general understanding of blood pressure, what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through each medication and how each medication works on your system so you can understand what possible side effects you may have from those medications. But ultimately, I want to point out that if you have high blood pressure, you don't have a medication deficiency. You have a problem in this cascade somewhere, and if you fix that underlying problem, you don't actually need blood pressure medication. Now, I am not encouraging you to stop your blood pressure medication. If your blood pressure is over 140, you will do better with a medicine to keep your blood pressure under 140 than if you didn't take it. And the reason for that is when the blood pressure is too high for too long, you start strengthening the arteries, and this is why one of the reasons of the longer you have high blood pressure, the higher your blood pressure actually gets. It's no different than working out your biceps. If you work out your biceps every day, your biceps will eventually get stronger, and as it gets stronger, you can lift more weights. Your arteries are the same thing. If you constantly keep pushing too much pressure down the arteries, they get stronger and stronger, and as they get stronger and stronger, your blood pressure actually goes up and up and up, and eventually you get to stroke levels. We've proven that over time, if you strengthen these arteries too much, they actually get more brittle, they're more ready to accept plaque and cholesterol buildup, and once that happens, each time the heart beats and those arteries squeeze and relax, you can actually get cracking in the surface, and when you get a crack, that's when you get a blood clot in the artery. When you get a blood clot in the artery, that's when you actually have a stroke or heart attack. Bad thing. So keep your blood pressure under 140, but anything you can do to reduce it naturally and get off of medications is always a win. Any doctor would agree with that. So I'm going to go through each blood pressure medication class and kind of describe how it works. The number one thing I want to start with is diuretics. So diuretics like hydrochlorothiazide or chlorothalidone, those are medications that basically work on the kidneys. So let's write diuretics. This diagram is going to get a little messy. So diuretics work to reduce the salt intake that the kidneys can handle, and as it reduces the amount of salt the kidneys absorb, the actual blood volume decreases. And when the blood volume decreases, well, your blood pressure decreases just because there's less blood going to the heart. So if there's less going to the heart, there's less going to the arteries, now your blood pressure is lower. So basically, diuretics are putting you in a controlled state of dehydration in order to lower your blood pressure. So you can imagine some of the side effects you would get from that. But it's not ideal to be in a controlled state of dehydration, so it's best to fix the underlying cause. That's diuretics in a nutshell. Number two is going to be calcium channel blockers. Calcium channel blockers like amlodipine, nifedipine, those are the most common, amlodipine being the most common. And so calcium channel blockers, we'll just write CCB here. Calcium channel blockers work by relaxing the arteries. They just directly work on the artery wall, the muscle wall of the artery, and they say chill out. You can't contract, you can't squeeze, just relax. Thus, your blood pressure comes down. Now, unfortunately, because they work on the smooth muscle, or the muscle of the artery, they actually also work, and I won't draw it to mess up our diagram, but the calcium channel blockers also work on the veins. They relax the veins. So if you relax the veins too much, they become leaky, and that's why the most common side effect with calcium channel blockers is leg edema, because all those veins, the reservoirs holding all the blood in your legs, start getting a little leaky, and you start getting edema in your legs. So that's a common side effect. Next on the list is ACE inhibitors and ARBs. Now, these are the most common medications that are used. These are things like Lisinopril, Losartan, Valsartan. Those are the angiotensin receptor blockers. But in general, they work via the same mechanism. They are the most common, very well tolerated, minus a cough. They really don't have a whole lot of side effects. So in order to understand how the ACE inhibitors and ARBs work, we have to get into a little more detail of the hormone cascade that happens in the kidneys. So as the cortisol and aldosterone stimulate the kidneys and blood pressure entering the kidneys stimulates a hormone cascade, there's hormones that come out called angiotensin, and this angiotensin hormone actually goes to directly stimulate the artery. That's where we got its name. Angio meaning vessel, tensin meaning tension or strength, and so that hormone from the kidneys directly stimulates the arteries to squeeze. So the ACE inhibitor drug, the lisinoprils, or the things that end in opril, they block this hormone from being made, angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor. So it prevents this from making the hormone that stimulates the artery. A newer class came out after the ACE inhibitors called ARBs, or angiotensin receptor blockers. And basically what those do is if there's a receptor here for that hormone, it just blocks the hormone right there. Because they came out later, they were thought to be new and improved and better, and ultimately the research kind of said, no, they may be newer and improved, but they're not actually better. So in my general stance, I always like to have people on the lisinoprils instead of the valsartans, losartans, the ARBs. The difference is minute, so if you're already on an ARB, I wouldn't really go encouraging you to switch as long as your blood pressure is well controlled. That's the most important part. Next on the list is aldosterone blockers like Spironolactone. These are not very common in the world of blood pressure reduction, but if you have heart failure or know someone with heart failure, then you might hear it. So aldosterone blockers just work here. By blocking aldosterone, you stop the kidneys from absorbing salt. If you stop the kidneys from absorbing salt, you lower the blood volume, thus reducing the blood pressure. This is kind of like a diuretic as far as it plays with salt, but they're usually not powerful diuretics, so most people don't notice going to the bathroom more often. The big downside with aldosterone blockers is they actually work as a testosterone blocker as well, so it can actually reduce your testosterone level. It doesn't reduce the levels, it reduces the effect of testosterone. The last on my list is beta blockers, and these are my least favorite medication. So the beta blockers actually work to block the sympathetic nervous system. So the sympathetic nervous system, when it releases its hormones to stimulate things around the body, it's releasing norepinephrine, epinephrine, and it's stimulating receptors all throughout your body. You have receptors for these all over the body, alpha and beta receptors. Primarily, beta receptors are found in the heart. So with beta blockers, they're trying to block the sympathetic nervous system from stimulating the heart to increase the contractility and increase the stroke volume. Way back in the day when beta blockers were first invented, we discovered that they reduced heart attacks and reduced heart attacks. After someone had a heart attack, it reduced their further heart attacks. So when that came out, we thought that it reduced heart attacks from people that have never even had a heart attack. And people believed that for decades, basically. And if anyone was at risk for a heart attack, they were immediately put on a beta blocker, basically. So if you had any sign of high blood pressure, high cholesterol, you were immediately put on a beta blocker. But in 2013, I believe, was the landmark trial that came out and said, actually, if you've never had a heart attack, beta blockers don't really work all that well to reduce your chances of having a heart attack, but they work really good if you've already had a heart attack for the year after that heart attack, not necessarily going forward. So they're my least favorite because they have the most side effects. You're blocking the entire sympathetic nervous system in hopes to reduce one thing, the blood pressure, and by doing that you get some significant side effects. The most important is the fatigue and kind of low energy that happens with beta blockers. It can affect erectile function. It can affect your ability to get to elevated heart rates. And in order to exercise and work out and feel good about your workouts, you need a higher heart rate. That's supposed to happen. So with beta blockers, it can block that effect. So that's the general rundown on how medications work in this diagram, where they work, and how they affect your body. And we mentioned some side effects. So the next thing we're going to get into is things that can stimulate blood pressure, things that can reduce blood pressure, the other factors in your life and how they interact.